And she has 30 seconds remaining.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to say that I care deeply about our environment. I want clean air. I want clean water. I want to be able to be good stewards of the land that we have been gifted here in the United States of America. And I don't believe that pursuing these extremist Green New Deal scam policies is advancing that agenda that we have. I don't want to spend tax dollars on these initiatives and this purpose. I want to do the work of the people, and I believe that my amendment gets us one step closer to that by reducing the salary of Ms. Klein to $1. Madam Chair, I yield.
Nice.
Once again, I will say that we're going to have a litany of amendments from people who don't believe in climate change, no matter what they say, no matter how many times people on the other side of the aisle say, oh, no, I really want clean air and clean water, but I don't want to do the hard work that has to be done. And to call these policies extremist, Green New Deal policies is just a way to dismiss that we have a serious problem before us. We have serious work to do. It is our responsibility to protect the planet for future generations, to make sure that we can continue to live and exist on this planet. I reject this amendment, and I yield back.
Colorado.
Rise to offer my amendment that redirects $2 million to hazardous fuels reduction activities within the Bureau of Land Management to prevent catastrophic wildfires and save lives. The year I was elected, Colorado suffered the worst fire season in Colorado history with the 3 largest recorded wildfires we have ever had. Hundreds of homes were destroyed and evacuated, and Coloradans endured more than 100 days of fire. The Cameron Peak fire burned more than 208,000 acres and more than 460 structures to the tune of $6 million in property losses. The East Troublesome fire on the border of my district killed 2 people. Coloradans also suffered severe health issues resulting from significant smoke from these fires. Wildfire smoke causes serious disorders, including eye and respiratory tract infections, reduced lung function, bronchitis, exacerbation of asthma, and even premature death. Catastrophic wildfires also cause significant damage to the environment. A few years ago, NASA concluded that one catastrophic wildfire can emit more carbon emissions in just a few days than all of the vehicle emissions in an entire state over the course of an entire year. Decades of mismanagement has left our nation's federal lands vulnerable to insects and disease and ripe for catastrophic wildfires. The good news is there is finally significant bipartisan support throughout the country to prevent wildfires, and the Forest Service is seeking to treat 20 million acres of national forests and grasslands and 30 million acres of state, local, and tribal and private lands over the next 10 years. However, we need to do more, as federal agencies have stated that more than 1 billion acres throughout the country are currently at risk of catastrophic wildfires. Our federal lands are overgrown and poorly managed, making them more susceptible to wildfire, disease, and even bark beetle attacks. There are federal lands in Colorado and the West where we once had 50 to 100 trees per acre, but now we see proving the overgrowth of our forests. There are also 6 billion standing dead trees in the western United States. Some people call that a problem. I call it a tinderbox waiting to ignite and burn. Fuels, treatments are effective, and federal agencies have made clear, and I quote, over 90% of the fuel treatments are effective in changing the fire behavior and or helping with control of the wildfire, end quote. Let's put the lives of the American people first, take significant action to benefit our environment by passing my hazardous fuels reduction amendment and redirecting $2 million to these hazardous fuels reductions activities within the Bureau of Land Management and I encourage the adoption of my amendment.
Seek recognition.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I claim time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I'm very, very supportive of increasing funding in this important program. And I want to thank the chairman for his work over the years, hard work and bipartisan work in combating wildland fires. But I simply cannot support the offset proposed for this amendment. Funding for the EPA in the base bill is already cut $1.8 billion below the enacted level, and this reduction makes it impossible for the EPA to carry out its mission. We need the worker bees of the EPA to keep the EPA moving forward for the American public. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back my time.
The recognized.
Madam Chair, I am proud of my party's work in reducing taxpayer spending by $1.8 billion in this bill. And I also am encouraged to find even more offsets where we can redirect funding and put them to a more appropriate use for the taxpayer, showing that their best interest is what we are all here serving in Washington, D.C. on their behalf for. Madam Chair, again, I support the adoption of my amendment that redirects $2 million for the fuels hazardous management in the Bureau of Land Management. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Colorado.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise to offer my common sense amendment that redirects $2 million of the Inspector General to combat waste, fraud, and abuse within the EPA. As a proud member of the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability, I am a firm believer in increasing transparency of federal programs and actions within the executive branch. Honest, hardworking Americans should be able to trust that their tax dollars are being spent responsibly and for their intended purposes. The EPA Office of Inspector General is charged with providing critical oversight over tens of billions of dollars that are spent by the EPA, U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board, as well as more than $100 billion that is being doled out through the so-called Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the so-called Inflation Reduction Act and the so-called Inflation Reduction Act that we all know did nothing to reduce inflation. Ask anyone you meet in a grocery store. Unlike other Inspector General offices, the EPA IG did not receive additional funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, Expansion Act, to carry out the additional oversight mandates associated with this law. Oversight by the IG is critical to ensure that the EPA, as well as its grantees and contractors, are responsible stewards of scarce American tax dollars. The IG also seeks to root out fraud, waste, and abuse, mismanagement, and misconduct within the agencies it provides oversight to. Recently, the IG identified significant taxpayer risks and vulnerabilities that are associated with the Clean School Bus Program. Sounds great, right? The Inspector General pointed out, and I quote, "There is a high potential for, among other things, falsely substituting or duplicating requests from multiple federal agencies for the same or very similar materials and associated labor," end quote. Ever since the passage of the Inspector General Act in 1978, Inspectors General has uncovered billions of dollars of fraud and exposed numerous instances of criminal wrongdoing. The EPA IG is no exception. During the first half of the fiscal year of 2023, the EPA IG identified $135 million in wasted spending, fraud avoidance, and other monetary benefits to American taxpayers. However, vigilance by the EPA Inspector General is needed now more than ever for the more than $100 billion of Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act that have been distributed and are still going out the door. Funding currently allocated in this bill for the EPA IG is significantly below the budget estimate, yet they are being asked to do significantly more. My common sense amendment will help ensure that the Inspector General has the funding and resources they need to provide strict oversight of the EPA. I have found a pay for, so this is not deficit spending. We are not wasting taxpayer dollars. We are redirecting these $2 million, and I urge my colleagues to support my amendment to redirect important resources.
For 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, to be clear, I fully support the oversight efforts and believe in the mission of the Inspector General's office across this government. It's vital. When I was former chair of this committee, I supported their work. I supported their work as the former chair of the Defense Subcommittee and as ranking member. But I have to strongly disagree with the offset and the treatment of the EPA in this bill in general. In base bill, the EPA is cut by nearly 20%. Almost every single account is cut except for the Office of the Inspector General. So quite frankly, the Inspector General's office does pretty well under this bill being protected. Cutting every single program at the EPA and seeking to increase funding for only one office, which happens to be the Oversight Office, is clearly an attempt by the majority to politicize the Inspector General, and that to me is just unacceptable, Madam.
1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for yielding. I rise in support of this amendment to provide additional funding for the EPA Office of Inspector General to conduct important and necessary oversight agencies. I've spoken with several of the Inspector Generals that have said that with all of the funding that went out last year, funding that went out to the EPA and to other things, they don't have enough money to do the oversight to make sure that the money that was spent in the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill, and other things are properly spent. And so that they've asked us, actually, and several of my colleagues on this side of the aisle, Mrs. Boebert and Mrs. Bice, have also suggested that we need more money in the Inspector General's accounts. So I'm supporting this amendment, and I hope my colleagues will also.
Say that again. Gentlewoman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. From day one of this regime, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris declared an all-out war on American energy production and exploration. They have made very clear that they care more about appeasing the radical climate change activists than protecting the millions of oil and gas workers and producers in America. I was fluid mineral lease and leasing process, which mandates provisions from the partisan so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which increased the royalty rate for production on federal lands while also increasing and creating new fees for domestic energy producers. This new fluid mineral leasing rule is further proof that the Biden-Harris regime is using every tool in their administration to dismantle American energy production. It increases bonding levels for production on federal lands and proposes ending nationwide bonding and increasing the minimum bond amounts for individual lease bonds and statewide lease bonds from $10,000 to $150,000 and from $25,000 to $500,000, respectively. This significant increase will tie up capital that would otherwise be put back into production and is unjustifiable, as there are only 37 orphaned oil and gas wells on BLM-managed lands. These increases will impact smaller producers who can't afford to operate in the market. These additional fees will ultimately harm returns and reduce revenues to state and local governments by disincentivizing development on federal lands. The rule also introduces the idea of using preference criteria to inform the BLM selection of lands for lease sales. BLM's rationale for this change is to avoid conflict in areas, quote, with sensitive cultural, wildlife, and recreation resources, end quote. This means that BLM field offices could avoid leasing in all areas with endangered or threatened species, critical habitat, or nearby recreation areas, a move that would greatly limit leasing on our federal lands. With the wars happening in the Middle East and in Europe, and with OPEC significantly lowering oil production, we cannot rely on other foreign nations to control our energy supply. America makes the cleanest energy in the world. We do it the most responsibly. American innovation, in particular fracking, has allowed America to be the global leader in reducing emissions since the year 2000. We need to stop buying oil and gas from Russia, stop begging OPEC, Venezuela, and Iran to produce energy for us, and start producing more energy responsibly here in America. I am ready to bring back the American roughneck and to drill, baby, drill, because no one does it better than we do here in the United States of America. We must restore American energy dominance and produce clean, reliable energy right here in America. Mr. Chair, I urge the adoption of my amendment, and I reserve.
Is recognized.
And first and foremost, I do not believe that the United States government purchases oil from Russia. We have sanctions against them, and we do not purchase oil from Iran. Mr. Chair, this amendment is one more controversial poison pill writer that sadly shows the extremist Republicans are not interested in bills that can gain bipartisan support and become law. The Fluid Mineral Lease and Leasing Program rules revises outdated. These haven't been updated for years, and it's our responsibility to make sure the taxpayers get a good return on our natural resources when they're put out to lease. So what this tries to do is just update these outdated fiscal terms on offshore leases, oil, gas program, including bonding requirements to protect taxpayers, royalty rates, and minimum bids to make sure that U.S. taxpayers get fiscal terms on offshore leases, oil, gas program, including bonding requirements to protect taxpayers, royalty rates, and minimum bids to make sure that U.S. taxpayers receive a fair amount for their public lands when they're used as lease materials. The rule aims to increase the returns to the American taxpayers. I can't say this enough. It's to make sure that taxpayers are getting a fair shake, that they're assured of a fair return from the extraction of natural resources on public lands, and to discourage speculators and improve responsible stewardship as directed by Congress. Now, we're here to protect the cultural and natural resources of our public lands for future generations, and that means when they go out to bid, that we make sure that the royalty rates and the minimum bids serve the taxpayers well, and bonding requirements to protect tax.
Simpson from Idaho.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the lady for yielding. I rise in support of the amendment. This administration continues to put out rulemakings that seek to attack American energy producers with burdensome costs and regulations. These new costs will ultimately be passed along to consumers, driving up energy costs for American families and further shifting production to countries that are not our friends. We must utilize an all-of-the-above energy approach to energy production and stop hampering domestic energy production. It would be interesting to note that in the year 2020, we were actually energy independent in this country. We are no longer. And yet we have the energy here in this country, but we refuse to use it. Therefore, I support the gentlewoman's amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman.
Chair, I want to state another fact for the record. When we extract oil and natural gas out of public lands, it's sold on a global market. So when it's sold to other folks. So if we're running into energy independence challenges, as was pointed out. Part of that's because it's sold on the global market. I also want to point out, for the record, it's been almost 4 decades, since the taxpayers have had bonding requirements, royalty rates, and minimum bids looked at to make sure that they're protected. Let me close with this. Once again, my Republican colleagues are disregarding the law and trying to circumvent rigorous practices to put the rules up to date. And nullify public comments also happens with this amendment. We just can't close our eyes to the impacts of climate change that we're experiencing as our country, our health, our livelihoods, food security, and quality of life all depend upon a healthy ecosystem. And I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment and focus instead on addressing climate change and being good stewards of our public lands and resources for the benefits of future generations. And that means refreshing and updating almost 40-year-old oil, gas, and mineral leasing. With that, I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Colorado. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise to offer my amendment that prohibits funds made available by this act to be used for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Accessibility Council at the Department of the Interior. In February of 2022, Secretary Haaland established the first ever Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Council through Secretary's Order 3406 to incorporate these practices into the department's work across. Let's be honest here. The DEI agenda is a destructive ideology that breeds hatred and racial division. It has no place in our federal government or anywhere else in our society. DEI exists to be a jobs program for otherwise unemployable holders of gender studies degrees who ruin just about everything they touch. Since taking office, the Biden-Harris regime has implemented DEI policies across virtually every agency in the federal government. The DEI is focused on coddling unequipped and incompetent employees, and I think we've seen that by all of the resignations from these DEI hires in this administration in just a few short years. As we saw a mere 11 days ago, DEI hires and incompetency at Secret Service were responsible for letting a deranged gunman come centimeters from killing President Trump. And I'm not talking about the folks who were there, boots on the ground. I'm talking about the disgraced director of the Secret Service who resigned today after scrutiny from both Republicans and Democrats, and those all throughout our country. Mr. Chair, we should no longer allow DEI in the federal government to continue to divide America and waste taxpayer money. It's absurd to fund these diverse policies, and it's time for Congress to put an end to them once and for all. The Department of Interior should be focused on restoring American energy dominance, not pandering to radical leftists. This is not about race or gender or anything else included in the DEI agenda of the left. This is about having the best, most equipped, most qualified personnel in their positions, no matter what their race or gender are. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment to abolish this demonizing DEI council. Mr. Chair, I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves the recognized. For what purpose does the gentlewoman
Still from
recognition?
Minnesota. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentlewoman is recognized. For what purpose does the gentlewoman
Still from
recognition?
Minnesota. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wrong in the strongest opposition possible to this amendment. One of our greatest strengths as a nation is we learn, we grow, we change. And that means diversity is a great strength in this country. There was a time, Mr. Chair, when women couldn't vote. There was a time when juries were only men. There was a time when it was unthinkable for a woman to join a police department, or a woman to be a doctor. The place was to be a nurse. There was a time in our military in which women could be test pilots here at home during the war. And after the war, they were no longer allowed to be pilots in the sky flying commercially. Diversity. I wrong in the strongest opposition possible to this amendment. One of our greatest strengths as a nation is we learn, we grow, we change. And that means diversity is a great strength in this country. There was a time, Mr. Chair, when women couldn't vote. There was a time when juries were only men. There was a time when it was unthinkable for a woman to join a police department, or a woman to be a doctor. The place was to be a nurse. There was a time in our military in which women could be test pilots here at home during the war. And after the war, they were no longer allowed to be pilots in the sky flying commercially. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. The American experience is not a singular experience, and diversity programs exist to recognize this. I'm going to give another example, Mr. Chair. When I was in the state legislature in Minnesota, we had a vibrant Hmong community that came here after the Lao war in Vietnam. It was a secret war in Laos. And the Hmong community came here, and they were very outdoors people. And, understanding and making sure that they understood our natural resource laws, we decided we wanted to reach out and include that diversity. And so we went out, and I was part of legislation that was written, that we asked our Natural Resources Department to look for qualified people, hires Vietnamese, Lao, Cambodian people to work with our wonderful diverse community in the Twin Cities and have them feel included and wanted because we wanted them to experience the great outdoors in Minnesota. Did that. They were well qualified, well respected, and in fact, just this year, I was surprised. One of the fathers came up to me when I was doing my recruitment and acceptance for going into the military academy, and he said, "You don't remember me, but because of you, I felt like I could do this job, and I did it well." And he retired from the state of Minnesota, working for the Department of Natural Resources, and I appointed his son to go to one of our military academies. And that's the beauty of our country. And the fact is also that business leaders agree that having a diverse and inclusive workforce in the place is critical to their overall performance, because I was in sales for years. If you're selling to somebody, you better understand their culture, you better understand their needs and their wants. So the business community embraces this. So the attempt to defund or to block the implementation of these efforts only takes us back to a time when our nation's diversity, when women were not seen as an asset. So I oppose this amendment, and Mr. Chair, I'm not going to speak on this any longer. This has been replayed over and over and over again, and for me, it is hateful, it is hurtful, it is harmful. We amended our Constitution numerous times to include diversity and inclusion. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. America is great, and we're going to make America even greater in the upcoming months and years. America is diverse. America is the great melting pot of the world. We have some of the world's... Thank you, Mr. Chair. America is great, and we're going to make America even greater in the upcoming months and years. America is diverse. America is the great melting pot of the world. We have some of the world's best, the world's finest, And it's amazing. All it took were people coming together to adopt the 19th Amendment, to allow women to vote. It took people coming together and collaborating to hire women as police officers or firefighters or pilots. Heck, I've flown a plane. Little Husky 180. Great time. Enjoying the sights of Colorado and all of the mountainsides. We have an economy right now that is failing because we have a party and an administration that is prioritizing DEI, something we didn't need to have women as police officers or firefighters or pilots or service members, those who would offer up their own lives to serve in the honor of our great country, who would stand for our flag. And because of DEI and this administration's woke agenda and their radical views, we have now been regulated into poverty. I remember a time also where women could, if they chose, stay home and raise their children. And now women are forced to work and have homes with 2 incomes because they cannot afford their groceries or their gasoline to get their children to school. And it's all because of the policies of this radical agenda. I'm fine with diversity. America is known for being a welcoming country. But this DEI program isn't what makes America great, and we never needed it to be great. And I'm calling for it to come to an end. I yield.